Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa has won his bid to interdict his predecessor's private prosecution against him. In a judgment delivered today, the Gauteng High Court in Johannesburg found, among other things, that former President Jacob Zuma instituted the private prosecution of Ramaphosa for an ulterior motive. Now, as a result, the court declared that the nollie prosecute certificates issued by the NPA do not apply to Ramaphosa. The court further declared the summons issued against Ramaphosa to be invalid, unlawful, and subsequently set it aside. Now, in addition, the private prosecution itself was declared unlawful and unconstitutional and subsequently set aside. Well, let's get the very latest now from our reporter, Canny Maphanga, who has been following this case. Canny, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Well, the High Court setting aside, former President Jacob Zuma's bid to privately prosecute President Cyril Ramaphosa. Let's briefly unpack the judgment. Just talk to us about the key, principles of this judgment.
Well, good afternoon to you, Inati, and the viewers at home. Of course, this judgment now brings this issue of the alleged disclosure of the former president's health records to an end. Remember, the president was the third category, which is the alleged accessory after the fact. What he's been able to do is successfully get an interdict. That means that the former president, will not be able to bring this matter up again, even if he tries to follow it through due process. Of course, those nollie prosecute certificates that were issued right before Nasrec, those certificates have been set aside, as well as the summons, which informs the private prosecution itself, has been declared unlawful and unconstitutional. So that brings us to the end of this matter between the president and his predecessor.
How did we get here? Now, just talk to us about, other, of course, private prosecutions that were brought, to the fore by President Jacob Zuma, which ultimately also fell through.
Well, what brought us here, Nati, is that we're dealing, once I've said again, the alleged disclosure of his health records in his corruption trial at the KZN High Court in Pietermaritzburg. So the former president came up with three categories. That is the alleged perpetrator, alleged accomplice, and then an accessory after the fact. We already know that he attempted to haul a senior prosecutor that is actually in that corruption trial to court over the alleged disclosure, as well as a journalist who reported on the matter. And then again, once he launched a complaint to the president regarding what he believed to be a breach in the National Prosecuting Authority, the president then didn't decide to establish a commission of inquiry of sorts, but rather referred the matter to the Minister of Justice to refer to the LPC to investigate in that regard. That was not satisfactory to the former president, and that's where he roped in the current president as an alleged accessory after the fact. We all know that the timing, it happened around the time that the president was contesting for that position in the ANC as president, which he was successful in, and that is where the ulterior motive complaint came in.
The issue of the nollie prosecute and just the importance and the significance of it, especially where you name somebody, in particularly in this private prosecution case, that came up again. Just talk to us a little bit about what some of the sensitivities were and just some of the problems that the nollie prosecute that he was using again came up to the fore.
Well, the first one was pretty clear with who it referred to. The issues came up with the second nollie prosecute, that is upon which he tried to privately prosecute the current president, for this alleged offense that he is accusing him of. The issue there is that it didn't name anyone. It almost broadened the scope with respect to who may have been referred to in that docket that we're speaking of. Now, it was already explained by the president's lawyers that when the president was mentioned in the docket, he was mentioned under a certain context. It was the former president describing what had happened so far with the alleged leak. And it was in the instance where he described that he had reported the matter to the president to set up a commission of sorts into the alleged breach of the National Prosecuting Authority. And I am not surprised that the court came to a conclusion that the nollie prosecute certificates, when they were issued, did not apply to the president in that regard, because the counsel for the president laid the context upon which his name was mentioned in that docket during the hearing that was highly publicized on various platforms.
Do we know now, have we got any indication, particularly as it relates to the former president himself, in terms of what his next move is?
Well, the former president hasn't elaborated on this latest judgment today, but remember when the first two were set aside and those were interdicted successfully by the senior prosecutor and the journalist in question, the former president then said he would appeal. We haven't seen anything with respect to that yet, and that was a few weeks ago that this happened. So we're not sure at this point if the former president will accept the outcome of the Gauteng High Court. Remember, this judgment that we're speaking of now is a judgment by the full bench. So we're not sure if he'll accept that outcome or if there's any action further emerging from that. But we will be updated by the Jacob Zuma Foundation in due course.
And of course, we know that this was set aside with costs, and obviously judgment also indicating there that there was no kind of security that was put aside for this particular, prosecution. And I mean, last time, especially as it relates to Karen Moore and Advocate Billy Downer, that issue also came into, as problematic in terms of, does he actually have the money?
Well, these are two separate issues. One was the motion court and the other was the criminal court that you speak of. And in a private prosecution, you do have to secure that security. But I think the cost order here is quite self-explanatory. It was the former president that initiated this, and because of his efforts, or he couldn't seek another remedy, the current president rather, he was forced to defend the matter in the High Court. So therefore the cost order seemed appropriate in that regard.